What if the Associates were an 80s prog metal band? That's the scenario we'll be considering on this week's What If, How and Why. Hello, my name's Morgan Brown, and each week I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I take a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which a change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have around the house in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Party Phase 2 by the Associates, and I tried to convert that into a 1980s prog metal song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. So this week's What If video was actually a viewer request of sorts, at least, based on a suggestion from Acro Dave, who's a regular commenter, often chimes in with an insightful comment on these videos, so thanks for that, Dave. I think the suggestion was actually to do Party Phase 2 as a strictly new wave of British heavy metal song, but it was only back in December, I think, that I did a new wave of British heavy metal version of Hazy Shade of Winter by the Bangles, so I took the basic idea of that and just moved it forward a few years in metal terms, so hopefully that's going to be alright. I definitely like the idea because, yeah, I've long had a bit of a fascination for this song in particular. I somehow missed the Associates growing up, even though they were definitely releasing records all the way through my childhood. It was only really when I was in my early 20s that I discovered them. I got a job where I was working in an environment where we had the radio on all the time. The station of choice was generally BBC Radio 2, and a lot of the time they were just playing kind of really bog standard stuff, but one of the records that must have been on kind of the B or C list that just came round once every 6 months or so was Party Phase 2 by the Associates, and it was such a unique and odd record that it always just made me stop whatever I was doing and kind of really prick my ears up every time I heard it, because although it fits in a way quite nicely with a lot of the other stuff that was going on in British pop in 1982, there's really nothing else that sounds quite like it. I mean, obviously Billy Mackenzie's vocal is quite astonishing, soaring and operatic and somewhere between beautiful and grating, kind of equal parts Shirley Bassey and Russ Mail from Sparks, I guess. But equally, the band has a really unique and interesting style. I mean, Sparks actually is probably a good reference point for them, that kind of art glam sound. Obviously, loads of Bowie in there, Roxy music, kind of elements of cabaret stuff as well. So it had this sound that sat somewhere in between lots of the different prevailing trends at the time. It was kind of post-punk, it was kind of new pop, a bit new romantic, a bit synth pop, without really falling too neatly into any of those categories. So I think the roots of the Associates go back to about 1976 when Billy Mackenzie and Alan Rankin initially met, and I think it started as a sort of some kind of twisted art cabaret duo before eventually by about 1979 morphing into this kind of post-punk act, the Associates. Initially it was just the two of them. I think they'd get a session drummer in, so that first album is just really recorded as a two-piece, and that's a great record. It's definitely a bit more just in the strictly post-punk vein than some of their later stuff, but already a strong Bowie influence. In fact, their first single was a cover of Boys Keep Swinging by Bowie, which I think had been a pretty recent release on the Lodger album for Bowie, which is a bit of a bold, slightly arrogant move on their part. But then by the time you get round to the Sulk album, they've actually become a full band. They've got a couple of particularly notable additions to the band in Michael Dempsey, who was the original bass player of The Cure, comes in, and I mean Party Phase 2 and also the follow-up single Club Country are really kind of marked by these quite out there and unique bass lines that Michael Dempsey comes up with, so he was a great addition to the band. Also Martha Ladley, who was also a member of Martha and the Muffins, not the Martha that the band named after. She's the second Martha to join the band, but she joins as well around the same time on keyboards and backing vocals, and she's another great addition to the sound and also to the band's image. I mean, when you see them appearing on Top of the Pops, there's always a great interplay between her and Billy McKenzie. That kind of really adds to the whole visual identity of the group. And they had a bunch of great singles, but Party Fears 2 is just something else, really. Really enigmatic lyrics. It's very hard to pin down exactly what he's singing about, but it sounds tremendously dramatic. It's got that incredible keyboard hook that just kind of keeps looping round. What a record. Absolutely great. And kind of seemed like they were poised for some kind of massive breakthrough with that album. I know Seymour Stein from Sire Records was really interested in them. That could have been the next big breakthrough, but Billy McKenzie just wasn't interested in touring. By all accounts, he just had a very short attention span for that kind of thing. Wasn't really interested in going out and doing the same show every night. Just wanted to move on to the next thing. So that kind of caused a fundamental split between him and Alan Rankin, who really wanted to pursue the band seriously. Bill McKenzie, who just wanted to keep making records and do the next interesting thing. And sadly, that really absolutely halted the band's momentum. So Alan Rankin leaves, and from that point on, the Associates continues, but it's basically just Billy McKenzie and assorted session people. And still did some interesting stuff, but they were always going to be thwarted by the fact that he didn't really want to play the industry game, didn't want to tour, didn't want to promote the way they wanted to. And also, as far as you can gather from accounts that you read and interviews I've seen, he just had no concept of budgets. All the records would just go wildly over budget, spending record company money like it was coming from a bottomless well, which ends up with situations where he's recording these massive indulgent records that then don't get released because the label can't see any commercial potential in them. And it, unfortunately, although he was clearly a massively talented guy, without, I think, Alan Rankin's presence there to kind of counterbalance that and channel it into a more focused product, he was a little bit lost. And unfortunately, the Associates never really kind of recaptured that early 80s peak. And even more tragically, after his mother passed, Billy McKenzie ended up taking his life at a very young age, and it's a real shame because there really wasn't anyone like him. Such a unique performer and really interesting songwriter as well. As I say, I mean, yeah, I guess there's a precedent to some extent with Russ Mail from Sparks with this wild kind of high-pitched vocal style. It's something you don't hear often in pop though, but something you do hear quite a lot more often in heavy rock, which is why I think the suggestion from Macro Dave was a particularly good one, because probably the closest vocal style in any kind of popular music, apart from Shirley Bassey I can think of, would be Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden. So as I say, this was initially suggested to me as a new wave of British heavy metal, and I think, as I said back in December, the band I always associate with that movement, although it was actually quite a diverse set of different sounds. Iron Maiden was the band that I always associate most with that movement, so that's the sound that always pops into my head when someone says new wave of British heavy metal. But specifically with that movement, I think of the Paul Di'Anno Iron Maiden years, so tough, street level, slightly punky, slightly grimy, kind of fast, aggressive metal. And don't get me wrong, they always had more ambitious, more proggy elements in the sound. I mean, even going back right to the start, they were doing things like Phantom of the Opera, which is obviously pretty ambitious. But even though there's certainly proggy elements to songs like that, it's still pretty raw, pretty hard-hitting, which suited Paul Di'Anno's vocal style. When they ended up getting Bruce Dickinson on vocals, that definitely allowed them to do different things musically, and his vocal style suited some slightly different musical stylings. It wasn't just Bruce Dickinson either. I think in the evolution of the Iron Maiden sound, I guess the first thing is Adrian Smith coming in on guitar, who has a bit of a more melodic style, and you start to see that more and more like the longer he's in the band. And then Clive Burr gets replaced on drums by Nicko McBrain. I mean, Clive Burr was an amazing drummer, real classic sort of rock and roll swinging drummer. Nicko McBrain has a bit more of an 80s metal precision to him, and again, that leads the band in a bit of a different musical direction. So from this raw, gritty music they're making at the start of the 1980s, by the mid-80s, things like Somewhere in Time, you see the band getting both more ambitious and more polished. So longer songs with more complex complex structures, but also much more melodic, a bit more glossy. There's different musical textures coming in. So you start to hear synths on there. I think they were experimenting a lot with guitar synths at the time. And then by the Seventh Son of the Seventh Son album, they're in full-on prog metal mode, I would say, making these elaborate concept records with long, complex songs, different moods, so some slower, calmer, moodier stuff, some big anthemic stuff, some complex instrumental sections. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of when I'm talking about the 1980s prog metal sound. I guess the major precedent for that would be Rush, who, going back into the 70s, were combining these two separate strands, kind of the hard rock of Led Zeppelin and the like, with the progressive rock of King Crimson and Genesis and Yes. Those two sides of the rock spectrum that kind of came together in Rush, particularly in that run of albums 2112 and Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres. Those really had both the sort of heavy impact of a Zeppelin or a Sabbath and the complexity and ambition of Yes or Genesis. So I guess what Maiden were doing from the mid-80s onwards was taking that kind of template and just updating it with more modern sounds and a tougher, kind of more modern, heavier metal sound. It wasn't just Maiden who were doing this, of course, either. At the same time, you get bands like Queensryche, who I've listened to quite a bit while I was coming up with this week's track, and Fate's Warning as well, who I hadn't really been familiar with. I'd seen the name around, but had a bit of a listen to them. They were doing some really interesting stuff around the same time. King's X. There were a bunch of bands who were taking that 80s kind of traditional metal sound and bringing in these more progressive elements around the same time. And obviously that then leads to the likes of Dream Theater, who are still carrying the torch for progressive metal into the 21st century. But yeah, really the sound I was going for was that kind of late 80s Maiden thing. But yeah, so to go back to this week's track, obviously every week I need to come up with an alternative universe scenario to explain how this alternative version of the song came to life. So for this week, I figure in my alternative timeline, Billy Mackenzie and Alan Rankin meet in the latter half of the 70s as they do in our world, but instead of being bonded over their love of Bowie and Roxy Music and various esoteric cabaret acts and what have you, they bond over their love of Judas Priest and Rush, you know, the power and the aggression of heavy metal and the ambition and the drama of prog rock. So they decide that they're gonna start a band that brings these two elements together. So they put this band together and eventually come up with this 1982 album, Sulk, which in this timeline is a grand concept album, of course, because, I mean, if you're doing anything progressive, then there ought to be a concept album involved. And obviously Party Phase 2 is the big breakout single from that. And it seems like they're ready to conquer the world, but unfortunately their embrace of the rock and roll lifestyle and their profligate spending are their undoing, so they never quite recapture those heights. But the fact that they've captured this blend of the sort of power of the new wave of British heavy metal and prog rock right there at the start of the 80s is a massive inspiration. So in this timeline, it's actually the associates who inspire the likes of Iron Maiden and Queensryche to move in this more progressive direction later on in the decade. In attempting to turn Party Phase 2 into this progressive metal song, as ever, the first step is just taking the lead vocal and dropping it in the GarageBand, getting that synced up to the grid. Next stage is putting the drums on, so program that in on my MIDI keyboard, going for some kind of Nickel McBrain gallop for the most part, and then went back in and programmed a lot of fairly elaborate fills in just to try and make sure it sounded pretty progressive and musicianly. I think the original record fades out, and I didn't want to have a fade out on this, so after we get to the point where the vocals faded, I added a little tag. I thought to make things a bit more proggy, I'd do a bit of a last minute time signature swap, so in that tag section it goes from 4/4 into 7/8 time for a few bars. Once we got the drums on there, the next step was the bass. As I think I found last time, back in December when I attempted to do something a bit Iron Maiden-y, I can't do the Steve Harris fingerstyle gallop. It's just not happening, so tried that for about 30 seconds again and then just played it with a pick. So mainly just kind of hammering out that gallopy rhythm on the root notes, but then a few ambitious things up the neck as well, just to again keep things sounding a bit progressive. And then quite a lot of guitars, so a stereo pair of rhythm guitars, just chugging away on power chords. And then the main thing that I needed to cover with the guitars was that huge keyboard hook that is probably the most memorable thing apart from the vocal of the original record. So decided I was going to do that in harmony guitars. So it's mostly done with a pair of harmony guitars, and then a little later on I add in a third just to kind of keep things building. And then there's one verse where I decided to drop the tempo to half time and have just a quiet section. So there's one more electric guitar that comes in there, just playing a much cleaner, heavily chorused rhythm part. So it feels like more of a progressive, multi-section kind of epic. Because we're looking for that later 80s sound, I thought I was going to work a few synths in there too. So I've got a pair of pads, one on each side, that just fill in a bit of space in a few sections. And then I've got a little kind of analog lead that comes in and plays a few fills, kind of playing off against the lead vocal in a couple of sections as well, which I thought was quite a nice little touch. And it also does quite an elaborate line during that outro tag section in 7/8 as well. And there wasn't really much more to it, just as a couple of final touches. I added a bit of soundscapey synth noise in the introduction, just over that introductory drum fill. And then just to give it that final dramatic prog rock flourish at the end, added a gong, because so many times you see prog rock drummers and they've got these gigantic kits with a gong at the back, which only gets hit once during the set. So I thought, well, we'll have that once being at the end of this song. So finished off with this big dramatic gong strike, and there you have it. And then for the video, as usual, started off trying to find some cool footage of them performing the song back in the day. So interesting old bit of TV footage with Billy and Martha in some kind of flight crew uniforms. I don't know what's going on there, but it's quite entertaining. Obviously I needed some heavy metal guitar action going on, so I've got some 1980s footage of Queensryche, which I've borrowed some elements of to insert in there too, to make everything a bit more metal. And then just to add a bit of an 80s science fiction fantasy element to emphasize the sort of fantastic nature of this sort of epic prog thing. Thought it might be fun to insert a bit of 80s animation, so got a couple of little clips from the movies called something like Star Chaser, The Legend of Orin, or The Fable of Orin. It's something like that. Basically an animated Star Wars knockoff from the mid-80s, which just tickled me a bit, and I thought I'd put a bit of that in there too, just to add an element of the fantastic. And then just to finish things off, a few of my usual mocked up posters, record sleeves, that kind of thing, just to insert the associates into that 80s metal scene as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun putting this one together. I mean, I've always enjoyed doing the metal ones anyway, and it's an absolutely cracking song, so it was great fun to just spend some time with that. And thanks very much to Dave for suggesting that as well, really appreciate that. If you did enjoy it, please let me know in the comments, and if you could like and subscribe, that always helps the channel tremendously. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any songs you'd like me to take a look at, any artists you'd like me to investigate, or any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, do let me know. I like having a go at these things. But yeah, otherwise that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.